Thank you very much and welcome everyone to this first in our series of events where we look at what we ought to do about a range of great social problems that confront societies. But our topic tonight is what should we do about democracy? And we've chosen this topic as our first topic because no matter what you think the biggest problems that face societies today, climate change, inequality, how we're able to respond to those problems will, to a large part, depend on the health of our democracies and the resources they provide us with. But as we all know, democracies themselves face challenges. So how we gather information, for instance, has changed enormously over the last decade. All over the world, populists are besetting democracy and threatening to change the way democracy operates. Many people think that democracies are becoming too unequal. So we need to reflect on the kind of challenges we face when it comes to our democracies and also what resources they offer us to do something about that. Let's get straight into it and discuss the first of our themes for the evening, which is the theme of the media and democracy. And I'd like to start with a quote. So the famous economist Amartya Sen, who won the 1998 Nobel Prize for Economics, famously said that there's never been a famine in a country with a free press. Now, what that tells us is something about the importance of the press and the media in how democracy works and how it's able to respond to challenges, to keep people honest, to provide us with information. But as we know, the ways in which we gather information have changed dramatically. So, Lenore Taylor, you occupy a very special place in the media in Australia, and with your editorship of The Guardian Australia, and I'd like you to start by reflecting on what some of those challenges the media faces in Australia and elsewhere, and what kind of challenges they pose for democracies.
Thank you. Well, I mean, to start with, obviously I absolutely agree that the media traditionally has fulfilled this absolutely critical role in a democracy of holding the powerful to account, scrutinising policy, etc., etc. And one would think that social media should be a good thing for that because it gives people agency and an ability to participate in the debate. But in effect, it's actually acted also as a huge agent of disruption in our industry, and it has made it very difficult to continue in that public interest journalism role. It's made it very, very hard. Firstly, it's made it really hard because it's really disrupted our business model. I mean, you know, Facebook and Google are eating our ad revenue and we have to find ways to adjust to that. Now, we are finding ways to adjust to it, but it's incredibly difficult, and we're going through a period where that means that it's really constraining the media from fulfilling that proper civic journalism role, which is so important for what we do. Partly, as well as sort of eating into our advertising revenue, Facebook, despite the fact that it says it isn't, is clearly a publisher. It's the most important place for dissemination of ideas and of news articles and analysis and whatever else you read. But it throws them all at people, you know, without any kind of discrimination, really. I mean, it's saying now it's going to change that a little bit. But actually, you know, a piece of really great investigative journalism that's taken 3 months to put together will come through people's feed right beside a piece of really shitty clickbait, or right beside a piece that's been made up by people in some sort of back room in Macedonia just for the money, as happened in the US election campaign. So, you know, that's a real challenge for us. I think it's also a challenge for Facebook, just by the way. I mean, there was a very interesting article in Wired magazine recently about Facebook's last 2 hellish years and how they're kind of confronting this problem, that the power that they have that's kind of baked into their business model and what they're going to do about it. And I think also social media disrupts the way that debate occurs. You know, we rely on articles being shared via social media. That's one of the important ways that, you know, that we distribute what we do. But people are much more inclined to share articles that confirm what they already think or have a really clear point of view. People don't share articles that are nuanced on the one hand, or on the other hand, articles, they just die on social media. Articles that challenge people's worldviews or challenge what they think don't do very well either. So in lots of ways, the social media is a huge challenge for us to do our role in a democracy properly, to fulfil those functions well. I don't think all is lost. I mean, we are developing other business models, and in a way their business models are more conducive to doing a good job. I mean, when we had to chase ad revenue, the incentive is to chase clicks. What we're doing now is asking readers to give us money voluntarily, or asking philanthropists to give us money. That means we're getting rewarded for the very best of what we do. So I think we're going to find a way through to do our job properly, but we're in a really tough time right now.
Thank you very much. Corey, could I bring you in at that point? Noel made some interesting comments there about all is not lost. You're a writer and a blogger and a thinker about these issues. How would you analyse the situation we find ourselves in with the media and democracy?
Well, I mean, I think The Guardian is distinct from a lot of other media entities, partly because it's historically been mission-driven. It's historically been an entity that, while like many other newspapers, it was basically a kind of awkward way to create public discourse in the process of helping people sell their cars, which is, the major source of income for The Guardian for the longest time was a newspaper supplement that sold used cars from one person to another. The traditional American and Canadian newspaper was a family-owned paper that was a way to sell washing machines to sports fans. So the people bought the newspaper to get sports scores. The newspaper was subsidized. The only reason it was affordable to get sports scores was because washing machine and white goods sellers wanted to advertise in them. And then the families that owned them felt a kind of patrician duty to their community, and so they peeled off some small chunk of the profits and used it to send someone down to the town council meeting and write about what was going on there. And that was a relatively stable model for a long time, and it was disrupted by the growth of classified ads. But the newspaper industry and news media in general has weathered a series of really intense technological shocks since its inception. I mean, really, the story of newspapers is one of the original telecommunications shocks, which is the print itself. But then you have radio, you have television, you have telegraphs, you have all these different major disruptions. Railway delivered broadsheets that were printed down one side, and then you could put the local news on the other. And they weather these shocks in part because they were broken up among little families who owned them and owned them locally, and who had a personal fortune that they used to buffer those shocks. The wealth hadn't been extracted and sent away. And in the 1980s, there was a revolution in the way we regulated firms in the developed world. The Chicago School promulgated this idea that the only time you would invoke antitrust scrutiny or monopoly scrutiny is if you saw a firm colluding to raise prices. But if they were doing predatory low pricing, if they were squeezing their suppliers, if they were becoming dominant across a horizontal sector or vertical sector or both, that was not a thing the state needed to intervene with. And what you saw was that the news media across the board was gutted. The investors merged newspapers, merged them with other kinds of news media, merged them across markets. They consolidated their newsrooms. They did things like flogged off their buildings in the CBDs of the largest cities in the world and then leased them back and left themselves vulnerable to shocks when rents went up, as the same phenomenon that had resulted in this new kind of antitrust theory also resulted in property bubbles that spiked and spiked and spiked again and made them extremely vulnerable there. And so, in part, this technological shock is a new kind of technological shock, but it's also a new technological shock in the face of a historically uniquely vulnerable news media because of what's happened in terms of consolidation there.
Thank you very much. Rebecca, do you think there's reason to be hopeful that these developments are in any way positive for democracies?
I suppose I look at it in terms of how the people that I research as a qualitative researcher, how they, the observations that they make about the changes that have happened to newspapers, television, both the content and how it comes to them. And I'm also really intrigued that, about how people respond when I give that kind of information to them. So I've been a researcher now for 15 years and, obviously started long before there was anything like a smartphone. And the very early part of the research that I did, my first piece of research over 15 years ago, was with young Australians, and at that stage they didn't have smartphones, they just had kind of Nokia phones. Do you remember them? They sound very retro. And I remember doing an interview with one girl who said, look, I think that we're all going to want these phones almost embedded in our bodies and as like a piece of something that we actually wear, and that we will get information constantly from them, and every other kind of information that we'll get will be channeled through this. And I remember thinking, wow, she's on something. She's clearly on something. But they saw that kind of change coming very quickly. There is consternation in the community both about the extent to which people, the ease to which they can create a bubble around them of just the information that they're comfortable getting. And I mean, people use Twitter as an example, but I don't think it's just Twitter, it's everything. And that has also, especially in the Australian market, flown, kind of spread over to any kind of media that we consume, whether you just get your worldview from the Australian or the Telegraph or the Guardian. And there is a recognition that that's problematic. It's part of the reason why the community's support for the idea that we should have an ABC that should, in theory, not be political, although there are people out in the community who think it's everybody who's there is a communist or everybody who's there is a Nazi. There is some kind of views about that, but it just shows that the importance of having public broadcasters in this increasingly polarised and politicised media landscape is important, and there's a public and community recognition of that.
Rebecca and I actually did a project together a little while ago, a podcast, where we tried to get 4 Australians from completely different political views and just to see whether they could have a conversation and find common ground around politics. And it was really quite interesting. It was challenging for us too, because, some of these people had views that weren't really entirely fact-based. And it was a really interesting exercise in getting out of our own filter bubbles, getting our audience out of their filter bubbles.
Could I bring you in here, Anthony, about the content of the views that you find that are able to be promulgated now, and how you think that affects the information that people get, and particularly how that might affect them as citizens in a democracy making decisions?
Well, there are people who celebrate the fact that cyberspace, the internet and social media has, as some people say, democratized debate and opinion. Everybody now can put their point of view out there, comment. News gets transferred very much more quickly than it used to if you had to wait for tomorrow morning's newspaper or tonight's news broadcast. But now it's out there on Twitter or Facebook almost instantly. And so that's been applauded by some. But at the same time, the problem with it is that you get 2 things happening. One is you get people now able to be their sort of one-person newspaper or one-person ABC, and they can publish their views. Now, in the past, you could only publish your views if either you got an editor to accept your article, or if you had a big pot of paint and you could do some graffiti. But now you can do it on your iPhone, and you can do it at any time of day or night. Look at Mr. Trump, he does it at 4 o'clock in the morning. So everybody can publish their views, and the result is a tsunami of opinion, sometimes of misinformation, of people making use of these media to put deliberate misinformation out there into the public conversation. And you get people so invested in their own opinions that facts don't matter any longer. You know, we've a big cliche now that we live in a post-truth world, but unfortunately, like a lot of cliches, it's true, because if you are very invested in your point of view, in your take on the situation, then you're not going to spend time doing a very careful audit on the sources or whether what you're saying or the things that you're repeating and reporting are really true. Now, it used to be the case that there was some media, print or broadcast media, which took a pride in being, outlets of record and of having very judicious and well-informed points of view to offer to the public debate. Such media still exist. I think the ABC and parts of the BBC and the Guardian, Times, maybe in London, still think of themselves in those terms, but they have access to very, very few people, relatively speaking. The tabloid press, which is toxic and appalling in the United Kingdom and perhaps also to some extent in other countries, but this huge flood of opinion out there in social media, that really has taken over, transforming the landscape. And it's a problem now because the reaction that we're having to it, too late and too little, is to say we've got to equip people to be extremely good critical evaluators of what they are presented with in this, this rage of opinion and news and false news and the like. But that, of course, is a task for education, and it will take time to get people back to being extremely clever at sorting out the wheat from the chaff.
Well, look, I was going to ask the panel to take up this theme, if you will, of the senses in which it's an advantage, if at all, to have these incredibly varied sources of content and volume of content as well.
I'd like to sort of put in a word for citizen journalists and reader input. I don't entirely disagree with the idea that the tsunami of information can be overwhelming and often misleading, but there's also really great information there. I often find new contributors or information from people who run their own blogs or we do reader call-outs and people send in information. So that ability to engage with readers and talk with readers and get information with readers and tap into the expertise that our readership has can also be a really good thing.
I suppose on that question of whether we're getting quality information or the right kind of voices through social media, I suppose within the Australian context, I'd encourage you all to follow Indigenous X.
Yes.
For people who don't know, it's basically a Twitter feed where a different Indigenous person, Aboriginal person, takes hold of the Twitter feed for a week and tweets stories of interest that they have or perspectives on what's happening in politics. And of course, there's no coherence. It's necessarily like different people have different views and different priorities. But even though I'm somebody who considered myself aware of a lot of those issues, just following this Twitter feed has exposed me to a lot more writers, thinkers, the kind of work that's happening in those communities. A wonderful counterpoint to the fact that, let's face it, most traditional media have followed Indigenous issues in terms of Cathy Freeman winning, an Olympic medal and petrol sniffing. So I think you can look at, and of course because it's so inexpensive to do and so easy to do, it's become an enormously kind of rich source of information and, like I said, a counterpoint to how Indigenous issues have traditionally been.
And we run a column each week from Indigenous X, and I think that has surfaced fantastic Indigenous voices, so that there are people in the debate who aren't Marcia Langton and Noel Pearson, so there's new voices, different voices. I agree it's a great thing.
I think it's always instructive when we describe the sins and excesses of the present day to seek parallels in the past and make sure that we're not, right there with Thoreau decrying the telegraph as the thing that will bring the news of Princess Anne's whooping cough across the Atlantic into the broad flapping American ear. But when you look back through the history of individual publishing, crank publishing even, you see that there's two broad categories. One is rich people who get to tell the story the way that they want, and it's full of the most horrific and ghastly blood libels we can imagine. It's Charles Lindbergh putting Henry Ford up to reprinting the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in English after the Tsars had spread it about Russia. It's, you know, blood libels here of Terra Nullius, and it's King Leopold telling his version of the story of what was happening in the Congo. And then you have these tiny beacons of I.F. Stone producing, you know, first-hand ethnographic accounts of labor struggles in America in the era of the Gilded Age and then beyond, in which transformative stories were captured and promulgated, and it changed the way a nation saw itself. Now, if we were to take away, you know, wave a wand and take away Facebook and leave just intact the ability of people to buy their way to the front of the queue, we have no shortage of would-be King Leopolds and would-be Charles Lindberghs who have very deep pockets and the ability to tell the story that they'd like to hear. So all that we would get rid of is the I.F. Stones. And so we'd be left with just the worst part of it. And I really have concern about that. I'm a technologist as well as a writer. And when it's very fashionable to talk about the technologists who were optimistic about the internet 20 years ago as naive. But I was there and I was optimistic about it, and I remain cautiously optimistic now. And I think that when we were optimistic about the internet, it wasn't because we thought it would be great. We thought it would be great if we didn't fuck it up. And one of the reasons we thought it would be great if we didn't fuck it up is because we looked at how people were able to interact with media then. When advertisers started to throw pop-up ads in our faces, we made browsers that came bundled with default on pop-up blockers, right? When a firm changed their website layout in a way that favored their shareholders' interests over the readers' interests, we wrote a script that made the parts of it that were inhospitable to us go away, or that aggregated it to a third place altogether. When Facebook started, they said, look at this creaking dinosaur that Rupert Murdoch just paid over the odds for at MySpace. We're going to make a tool that lets you log into Facebook, but have Facebook scrape MySpace on your behalf and show you what your friends are writing on MySpace in Facebook. And you can reply to them, and it'll send it back and say, I'm replying from Facebook because MySpace is so last year. Now, Facebook has just successfully sued a competitor for doing exactly this, a company called Power Ventures, right? What has changed is not our capacity as toolsmiths because what software tools do is they encapsulate expertise and then promulgate them to people who are of lower expertise and give them the ability to play back a recording of our expertise at their will with the push of a button. And what has happened in the last 20 years is an enormous shift of power on the internet, not just in how big the firms are, but in how much influence they have over the legislative and regulatory process, such that almost all of this toolsmithing that might act as a competitive hedge, that might let you delve into Facebook and see what ads you're not seeing by impersonating an altogether different person to Facebook, so you can compare what Facebook might show you with what Facebook is showing you, which is a thing that a lay person can interpret, right? It is how you become incredibly smart about media. All of that has been taken away. And so we have this very impoverished world, and we have last year's pirates saying that when they did it, that was part of the normal and legitimate progress of an industry. And now that they're admirals, they say that anyone who does it to them is a stinking pirate who should be hung up as an example to everyone else.
Well, look, on that theme of hanging pirates, let's change tack a little bit. I'm sure you're all familiar with the term the Anthropocene, which describes the epoch we live in and how human forces are now rivaling geological forces in their impact on the planet. I heard a term the other day which people claim to be a better description of our epoch, which was the Trumpocene, which of course describes the impact that people such as Donald Trump and other populists who inhabit democracies around the world are having on our daily lives and on our democracies. So we have Trump and we have people like Trump in Europe, and we have indeed left-wing versions as well as right-wing versions. Very
Plenty of
important
both.
distinction there. So trick question for you all. Thank you. You passed. What I was going to ask about that is the impact that we think that popularism is having on democracy. Anthony, if I could ask you to reflect on this, having written a great deal about issues to do with liberty and freedom and human progress, could you comment on that?
Well, the concept of populism is an interesting one, not least because it's been invoked to explain some of the unsettling events of recent years, like the Trump election and Brexit. And in order to try to get a handle on it, one has to take a tiny bit of a run at it and remember this, that all economies at all stages of their histories are always in transition. Economies are always evolving and moving, so some new things are coming on stream and some industries and sectors of the economy are being left behind with the people who populated those sectors and who are therefore unemployed or don't have the right skills to take advantage of the next phase of what's happening. So at any point in history, anywhere in the world, you could identify groups of people who are in that situation. That situation is one where good, sensitive, thoughtful government should be focused on those people, should be really working very hard to help them to move forward, to invest when there are difficulties of that kind in regions of a country or in particular industries. Governments that are wedded to sort of right-wing views about taxation or who think that austerity is the right way to deal with major financial crises in the world are going to exacerbate problems for those people who are in those difficult areas of the economy. And what you get is one of the worst and most toxic of phenomena in a society, which is increased inequality. Poverty is not itself the problem in a society. The real problem is inequality. And when it increases, what you get is resentment, you get hostility, you get a real sense on the part of people whose living standards have fallen or stagnated, that they really are being excluded, that they're being kept out of what's happening in their society. Since 2008, the financial crash, and actually for much longer, really for perhaps a quarter of a century or more, people on middle and lower incomes haven't really seen their standard of living increase all that much. Whereas people in the top 1 or 2% have seen their wealth increase actually fourfold since 2008. And that means that the real inequality in the advanced economies of the world is much greater than it was a couple of decades ago. And that has to be part of the story, part of what lies behind the invocation of a populist uprising against elites and governments that have left them behind. But if you think about it, people who are unemployed or people who are poor or people who are working a couple of jobs to try to make ends meet are not really in a very good position to start organizing and theorizing and getting together with other people and having a grassroots uprising. But what you do get is you get demagogues. You get Marine Le Pen, you get Geert Wilders, you get Nigel Farage, you get Donald Trump. You get people who go to those disadvantaged groups and say, yeah, you've got a problem. We know who's to blame. And then they point the finger at who's to blame. Vote for me and I will solve your problem out. Of course, most of the people who put that case to those who are in difficulty aren't going to solve their problem for them, but they're just exploiting the unease. They're trying to aggregate together groups of people who have that sense of being left behind. The point has been very well put about the United States in the last couple of decades that the great dream in the US is everybody can become a millionaire and everybody can be president. So you're in the queue and the queue ought to be inching its way forward. Things should be getting better. But in fact, the queue has been stuck for a long time now and you're marking time in the queue. And what's worse is that people are queue jumping. Women, Mexicans, gays, you get very cross because what?
Gay female Mexicans.
Gay female Mexicans, even worse.
Cool.
So
Right
you get even
dressers.
what?
Excellent dressers.
You get very, very cross And therefore, you get somebody who comes along and says, we know who to blame, we'll sort your problem out for you. What you get is the appearance of a populist upswelling, and it's actually something which is being harvested by demagogues who are going to make the situation worse. That, I think, is something like the kind of analysis that I would give about what's happened, because in the UK, the different groups of people who voted to leave the EU, I'm now going to be completely neutral about this and say it is the most stupid bloody thing that's ever happened in the history of the UK, is partly the result of demagogues, getting people to think wrong things about the situation. And Trump is somebody who lives in a penthouse on top of Trump Tower in Fifth Avenue in New York, man of the people, but poor white men following Trump because they think he's going to solve their problem for them. You can see that there is something in itself toxic about the very idea of supposed populism, which is really an artifact of demagoguery.
I think, Rebecca, were you going to come in on that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's interesting for me to reflect on all of what's been just said in terms of the implications for Australian politics. And we do have our demagogues in the populist kind of mould. We've had Pauline Hanson and Pauline Hanson 0.2. And even though, even though she's a terrible impact, she's a terrible contributor to Australian politics, she struggles to get beyond 5% nationally. I mean, when her candidates might get 8%, but we're not talking about yet at a point where she's ever going to be wearing a red hat, make Australia great again, and really got her, finger on the button of how the country runs. You've got somebody like Cory Bernardi, and I think we can see how that's going for him. And probably our most populist Prime Minister has been Tony Abbott. And, while he was elected Prime Minister, I mean, my dog would have been elected Prime Minister after that Labor government, and so, in fact, would have probably stayed Prime Minister for longer, potentially. And I'm not trying to be kind of trying to talk up Australia for that reason. I think that we could have a Trump and we shouldn't be complacent. But populism is how it's played out in Australian politics has been different. Part of that has been those extremes of inequality haven't been quite as extreme in the Australian community, although they are getting worse. And while we talk about income inequality, the real challenge in Australia is wealth inequality tied up with housing. And that's a genuine problem. And so we're starting to see where we do see the really corrosive impacts of populism is in the persistent kind of extraordinary attitude to asylum seekers in this country, and this obsession with the idea that they're all here to take our cars and places on the train, and just absolute paranoia, which to me thinks that most of the populism in Australia is not really about economic insecurity, or there are lots of anxieties. It's really cultural and social insecurity. It really is at the heart of the populist sentiment that I see in the research that I do.
Cory, you're very close to Donald Trump geographically. It's all in the timing. And what's your view? I mean, he's just passed over a year in office. How is American democracy going to fare with 3 more years of the Donald, do you think?
Well, I think this is the open question. You can see the Kubler-Ross grieving process playing out over and over again. But not just, but it's fractal, right? So yes, on the one hand, there's all this business about can we impeach him, and which is like denial bargaining and so on. But also within the Democratic Party grandees, there's this idea like, do we really have to stop taking money from banks and petrochemical companies in order to present a viable alternative? Can't we just do a little of both, right? Can't the DCC just continue to court huge amounts of money from the most corrupt global criminals you can imagine, but represent the working person in some sense? And I don't think anybody knows. And I have to say, so I'm a science fiction novelist. That's like my primary day job. And the one thing I'm keenly aware of as a science fiction writer is that we suck at predicting the future. mostly because the future is unpredictable. I'm with Dante. He took the fortune tellers and twisted their heads around 180 degrees and had them wander through molten filth up to their knees, crying down their backs while demons flogged them for the sin of insisting that the future was going to arrive on rails no matter what we did. I think the future is contestable, right? What happens depends partly on what we do, and that's why I bother getting out of bed in the morning. And the thing that's very exciting is the extent to which left-wing Democrats who hold positions that would be recognizable to a pre-Reagan era Democrat, positions about universal health care, $15 minimum wage, sensible laws about guns, and so on, the environmental rules, those Democrats are campaigning unapologetically on those issues, and it's remarkable. And at the same time, when you look at one of the major factors that brought Donald Trump the presidency, it's the votes of evangelicals who are very contradictory in this realm. You know, he's clearly, it's hard to squeeze him through the eye of a needle.
Can we try though?
Yeah.
Can we really try?
Or a needle through his, no, sorry. But the thing is that they would vote for Adolf Hitler if he were anti-abortion. And what's interesting is that I was raised by pro-abortion activists in Toronto. I was with my mom doing clinic defense when I was 6 years old. And in Toronto, up until the mid-1980s, early 1980s, the entire anti-abortion movement was Catholic, and Protestants were deeply suspicious of the anti-abortion movement on the grounds that it might be a form of crypto-papacy. And not only that, they were literally, I mean, this was what they were preaching from the pulpits, and not only that, they saw politics itself as worldly and unworthy of people who are concerned with things of the spirit. And it was the Reagan big tent that fused the religious right and the political right together that made abortion an issue that Protestants took to heart. What I find amazing and hopeful in an odd way about this is there are people today who in living memory thought that it was quite suspicious to be really worried about abortion, who today would literally vote for anyone provided they promised to block abortion. And the reason that is hopeful in this tiny, attenuated way is it shows that attitudes can change. They can change for the worse, but if they can change for the worse, they can change for the better. This thing that seems to have been here since time immemorial, that we've been fighting about abortion and the people who are really upset about it were evangelical Christians, turns out to be a phenomenon that occurred in living memory. And it's so universal now, we can hardly imagine it changing. And you know, when Thatcher said there is no alternative, it was demand disguised as an observation. Stop trying to think of an alternative. And I think that if you know that alternatives are possible, then we can start thinking of better ones.
By the way, I could never understand how it could be that you could be anti-abortion and pro-guns until it turned out, until it occurred to me that you wanted there to be plenty of people. You didn't want to terminate. You wanted plenty of people so you could shoot them later.
No. It's really simple. Life begins at conception, ends at birth, and can be renewed through incorporation.
Well, we've spoken a little bit about. I'm not sure there's a segue from that to anything particular, but look, we've spoke on the subject of abortion, gun reform. I mean, these are more prominent issues in countries other than this one. We could also add a number of other things that perhaps democracy is failing to address in the way that it should. We've spoken a little bit about inequality. We'd also have to add the issue of impending climate change to that list of things that are urgent problems that confront the people who live in democratic and indeed non-democratic societies. So, could I ask you, Rebecca, how do you think democracy is delivering on some of these big issues, and particularly, say, something like climate, where we seem to fail to be able to address it in anywhere near a speedy enough and substantial enough fashion?
Yeah, so I suppose when you say something like that, I want to break down what you mean by democracy. And I think the real failure here is not necessarily in the electorate's inability to recognise this as a problem, although there is some kind of ostrich-like behaviour, this is not happening or it's not that bad. I'm not saying that's not the case. I think the real failure is, and the failure is not necessarily with the structures per se of our government, it's the failure of the political parties. So I'll give you a very simple example. If you spend any time in rural or regional Australia or with farmers or primary producers in this country, and you talk to them about the issues that matter in their community, they will not say that it's asylum seekers or gay asylum seekers or any of those other kinds of things. They will mostly say they want better NBN, better healthcare services, and all of them are to some extent dealing with the real challenge of farming and producing food in a time of climate change. They might call it variable weather, or they might call it volatile weather. They might be in denial about how much people are contributing to it, but they're all doing it. Does the National Party, that's supposed to be the political party that represents the real interests of people living in regional and rural Australia, particularly people in the agricultural sector, have that same view? Are they pushing those, world-class NBN, best possible healthcare services, and how are we going to produce food, export food in a time of rapid climate volatility, whatever you want to call it? I can say no, and that's because that's what the National Party is taking to Canberra, not because that's what rural and regional Australians want, really, when you actually ask them. So there's a problem with how we translate the issues that matter to us into the people that we send to represent in politics. And climate change is one of them. While there's a spectrum of views about how serious it is and what's causing it, poll after poll after poll says that Australians believe it's happening. Now, what are they prepared to give up to do something about it? That's another question. But we've had the political class lag behind that. We've had them lag behind on marriage equality, completely incapable of dealing with it, and we had to go through a destructive, expensive and basically ridiculous process to show absolutely that the polls were right, that most Australians wanted it or didn't really care one way or the other. That was a moment where our evangelical Christian called Lyle Shelton, it was a bad day for him and it was a good day for everyone else. So we don't have as much of that kind of a problem in Australia as in America. So I think that we need to do something about the kinds of people we send into politics and the structure of political parties to improve, I think, that translation of what matters to people into action through our government processes.
Can I ask you about that, Anthony? We were talking a bit backstage about whether or not parties were a barrier or an enabler for facing some of these enormous challenges.
Well, on the question of how a country deals with the problem of climate change within its own borders, the answer has to be that there's relatively little that any one country can do by itself unless there is enough consensus in the international order. Climate change is a global problem, and it requires global solutions. That means that governments have got to agree and they've got to stick by the agreements. The Paris Agreement is one that requires everybody to sign up for it. Within a country itself, to get the whole country behind an international process would be the happy outcome of genuine bipartisanship, genuine agreement and consensus among different political perspectives in the country, able therefore to give the kind of leadership and example that people would need in order to give some things up to make it possible. But the problem is this, that the international order is an anarchy. It itself is nowhere near a democracy. There's no way of coercing countries to comply. And you can see how very quickly and easily it could happen that a major economy, like the US economy, for example, could renege on an agreement like the Paris Accords if you get a president like Trump who thinking that he is going to satisfy one constituency that supported him by reopening the coal mines or doing something anyway which just unseats the whole process, results in the kinds of constraints and coercions that in a democratic society makes the short-term electoral cycle force you into doing things that are not really helpful to the global fight against climate change, makes you do the things that puts you out of step with other countries. So until there is a worldwide consensus and a worldwide effort to deal with the problem, things like all the individual efforts that we make, and it's a good thing that we make them, recycling and so on, they are just a tiny little nibble at the problem, and they're not going to really solve it at all. So it has to be something where internally democracies have got to get real consensus, real agreement, show real leadership to people, make it a national thing that people are prepared to drive less or give up their cars or recycle properly, and then get everybody doing it around the globe, because it might almost be too late even now.
I think that there are threshold effects, though. So, Canada, we have the filthiest oil in the world. When your children are reduced to drinking their own urine to survive, you can thank the Alberta tar sands for it. And the reason the Alberta tar sands are staying in the ground right now is that oil isn't $115 a barrel anymore. And one of the reasons oil isn't $115 a barrel anymore is we've done enough capital investment in photovoltaic. And we are not going to reopen those tar sands. Because those PV cells have a 10 to 20-year duty cycle. By the time those PV cells are ready for replacement, first of all, they'll be 100 times more efficient because it's an information problem, not a material science problem. And second of all the people who used to know how to process tar sands will have gotten another job, and they're just will lack the industrial capacity. The capital intensivity of restarting the tar sand exploration will be like asymptotic to infinity. We'll never reopen it. Now, meanwhile, when the tar sands tar is sloshing around, it creates a kind of subsidy on a bunch of marginal activities that are otherwise not viable and that have substitutable activities, but it's only because oil was above a certain level that we were doing it. And it's true that one country can't force all the other countries to do something. But I tell you what, if you're worried about this tiny green sward that ridges, the outer ring of your country, turning as brown as the stuff on the inside of the mountains, you could do worse than creating and dumping photovoltaic cells well below cost on the global market. You'd be surprised at how much oil would end up staying in the ground if it happened. And I do think that there are opportunities for unilateral action that could have enormous effects on how we order our affairs. Lawrence Lessig says that we steer our societies by code, what's technologically possible, by law, what's lawful, by norms, what's socially acceptable, and by markets, what's profitable. And you can harness those in different ways to intervene in global affairs without having to put a gun to people's heads and saying, turn off your coal plants.
Lenore, can I bring you into this point? I mean, your paper's noteworthy for its coverage of climate-related issues. I mean, what do you see as the big sticking points for better action in democracies?
Well, domestically, I agree with Rebecca. I think that political parties are not doing their job anymore very well, and that the climate is a really good example of how that manifests. They're meant to be, the whole point of them is that they're meant to be sort of mediating vehicles for people with broadly aligned views, that they come up with a policy and then that they implement it. Malcolm Turnbull, we know what he thought about climate change, and as Prime Minister he's had to give up the best option, the second best option, the third best option and the fourth best option, and we still don't know the details of what his policy is, and that's all because there are members of his own party who are climate skeptics, and you can't actually create a rational climate policy and have climate skeptics agree with it. But the other side of politics, the other major party, is not much better. I mean, we've seen this week, Bill Shorten finally sort of pinged quite spectacularly by Cousins on the 7:30 report for walking both sides of the fence with regards to the Adani mine. Now, you either think that it's a good idea to open up a big new greenfields coal mining area, which will contribute a significant portion of the carbon budget that we have left in order to not push global warming beyond 2 degrees, or you don't. That it's an either-or question. You can't. And the thing that kind of epitomises for me how upside down political parties are, is that there were Labor strategists thinking about that question, that sort of globally significant question, in terms of what it would mean for the Batman by-election. It's just crazy. The good news, though, is that despite the dysfunction of both political parties as sort of organising bodies to come up with a coherent policy on this subject, and I do think Labor's sort of better, I mean, the Adani position is a problem. They do have a better climate policy. But despite the fact that neither side is really coherent, I agree that the economics of the issue, the technological advances, the reduction in cost of alternative forms of generating power are kind of circumventing the politics. So even in a country like Australia, where we have been completely unable to solve this issue for 10 years now, we've just been butting our heads against the same wall, it drives me crazy, we are actually making progress despite politics.
Mm. The thing that networks do is they lower the cost of working together. So you mentioned a Nobel Prize in economics earlier. One of my favorite, not a Nobel Prize, because it's not really a Nobel Prize in economics, was for Ronald Coase' 1937 theory of the firm, where he says the thing that we do with our institutions is coordinate our labor. It wouldn't do to have one person knitting a sweater and the person sitting next to them unraveling it. And so we institute organizations to lower the transaction cost to do things together. And that's why we have political parties, and that's why there's such a dog's breakfast. The internet radically lowers coordination costs and lets us do much more ambitious things with less institutional overhead. We make encyclopedias today with the kind of institutional overhead we used to bring to an ambitious bake sale. And so we now have really bold experiments. There's a guy named Zach Axley who ran the IT for the Howard Dean campaign and then the Bernie Sanders campaign. He quit the Sanders campaign to start a thing called Brand New Congress. They have a common manifesto that doesn't pretend that reality doesn't have a well-known left-wing bias, and so is therefore about gun control and health and all the rest of it. They found 500 vulnerable seats at all levels of US government that are vulnerable, where the candidate is vulnerable to being primaried within their own party. So in the selection process, when I lived in Hackney and had a fight with my local council, someone from Labour walked over and said, your councillor has a safe seat, and they were picked at the party selection meeting that had 8 people at it. He got his seat in the largest borough in the UK by 5 people raising their hands. He was elected by 5 people. They found 500 seats that are vulnerable this way. They have a common manifesto, a common fundraising platform, and their plan is to elect 500 politicians in the 2018 election cycle at all levels of government, Republicans and Democrats, who are in fact neither of them. They're brand new Congressites who believe in this single manifesto.
But political parties, I think, deserve to be disrupted.
Damn right.
Because they're not listening. They're not listening. They're not engaging. They deserve to be disrupted.
In the age of Corbyn and Sanders, it's fashionable to sneer at entryism. But this isn't your grandfather's Trotskyist entryism. This is a whole new kind of entryism.
It's interesting you raise the issue of crowdfunding, and we couldn't really talk about democracy unless we also talked about money. And one of the connections, of course, with climate is that some of the miners, they often have quite a lot of money. Someone told me the other day that the Koch brothers, I think that's how you pronounce it, the American fossil fuel tycoons, had spent since the 90s around $100 million on funding anti-climate science things, which is more than the IPCC paid to do its last few reports. So money matters for democracy, and it changes it. What do we think, perhaps, about the state of influence of money on current political systems in democracies?
In Australia, Australians like to think that money doesn't determine politics in Australia as much as it does elsewhere, because they read the news about the Koch brothers and the amount of money. But actually, we don't have really great transparency in terms of funding in Australia. I've always thought it was very odd that I could go online and work out if somebody had transferred some money in my account, but we find out 6 months after an election who has donated to that election. It makes no sense that happens. So we should really look at the issue of money in politics. The real problem about it is that both political parties take money from corporates. corporates spread it around. They tend to give more to the Conservatives, but they also give it to the Labor Party. And the other problem is the Labor Party have been really not great on this at all because they rely on union donations. And so it's very difficult to craft some kind of law that says that limits corporate donations and says that union donations are okay. That's not possible. So the whole nexus between the union movement and the Labor movement would be cut. So the entire way in which they do politics, because they've got a declining membership, I mean, really do have a declining membership, and they're really reliant upon that money to be able to continue to function, certainly to be able to continue to do the kind of advertising and work that they need to do. So it's a problem in Australia in a way that I think Australians don't fully understand. So lack of transparency, real delay in reporting about who donates to who, and the whole issue of basically both political parties don't really want to move on it.
Yeah, I think that last part's the important one. It's not hard to imagine potential kind of pie-in-the-sky ways of public funding, and you either choose public funding, in which case every voter gets a voucher they can use to fund you and it becomes much easier, or if you take $1 in private money, you are no longer eligible for any public money, and we can see who takes the public money and who takes the private money. The question is, are you ever going to get the turkeys to vote for Christmas, right? That nobody who has currently got their job that way wants it, but it's facially obvious that taking money from someone makes you beholden to them. You know, Sam Walton, who founded the Walmart Corporation, had a rule that if you were a buyer and you got a sales call, you were not allowed to take anything from that salesman, not a glass of water. You weren't allowed to have them push your seat in, because as soon as you and the sales rep were on the same side, you were no longer on Sam Walton's side. And Sam Walton said that there was only going to be one person in the world who would put $1 in your pocket, and that was Sam Walton, and everything you did would therefore be in his service. Now, Sam Walton and his heirs now argue aggressively that they should be able to give unlimited amounts of money to politicians without corrupting them. But this is, in the grand tradition of the business school, where in the morning you learn about Homo economicus and how we only make rational choices. In the afternoon you go to marketing class and learn how to trick people into making choices that aren't rational, right?
Yeah.
So in that sense then, you think is there good money and bad money? I mean, we've spoken about, or you've mentioned, Corey, that you might envisage a system where political parties or political entities, whatever they are, might take public money. Is that going to fix the problem, or are there groups that you shouldn't allow? I think at one point, I've now forgotten which Prime Minister, I think it was Kevin Rudd, that's right, in Australia, he banned real estate agents from donating.
He banned whom?
Real estate agents.
Real estate agents, yeah.
It was a state-based thing. I mean, in the 30 years that I reported on politics, the major parties could see that they needed to do something on this, and for exactly those reasons, they never actually got it done. They got close to an agreement, and then somebody would calculate that the other major party was going to benefit a little more, and the deal would fall apart. The need is really obvious. I mean, how much money did it cost the Minerals Council to knock off Kevin Rudd? I don't know, I think it was $27 million or something. It was certainly less than they were going to pay in the resource rent tax. The need for political donation reform is absolutely clear. But the only answer then is to have much higher levels of public funding, which the politicians are reluctant to put forward to the people, even though if they argued the case, I think it would be a very easy debate to win. And lots of, micro donations from, smaller players, and caps on spending. That's the only way that you can make it work. And also the Electoral Commission with actual power and teeth to investigate where money has come from, and a federal ICAC to look at when it goes wrong. If you had all of those things, the system would be vastly, vastly better.
Well, there's one area where we've had some, suggested law reform in terms of money in politics, and that's the new legislation to stop organisations like Get Up, but also other community organisations, and suddenly kind of classify them as political organisations under a new regime, which is an absolutely extraordinary move, mainly to try and shut down Get Up, but on top of it, a whole lot of organisations that do really good work are going to be swept up in that, and it's it's the law reform that we don't need in this area, but it's the one that the government is pursuing.
Yeah, you can see that there are two opposing problems there. On the one hand, you have the situation like in the US where these super PACs, as a result of a Supreme Court decision a few years ago, can raise vast sums of money outside the actual endeavour, allegedly anyway, outside the actual endeavour of a political party to support a candidate or a cause. And the result is, as has pretty well always been the case really in the United States, that you can quite literally buy office. You can buy a seat in Congress. If you've got enough money, you can buy the White House. So it's a massive problem there. In places where there are electoral commissions, in the UK, for example, there is one. It has no teeth. It has very few resources to investigate malfeasance. But even if you did have a strong electoral commission and did have teeth, you would always find ways to get money into the system outside the terms of an election campaign, for example, because these restrictions only apply during the course of the campaign. Look what happened in the case of the EU referendum. A lot of the money that was spent on some of the techniques, the big data analytics techniques that were used, was spent long before the referendum campaign started, so that it fell outside the limits. If there is any kind of answer to either problem, either where you have a free-for-all in the money or you try to control the amount of money that's spent on elections, if there is a partial answer, it's transparency. If you know who's paying and for what reason, what the agenda is, who they're supporting and why, then you can make your own mind up. You can say, okay, these guys have got a million advertisements, and the other guys have only got 10, and that's because the first lot of guys are being supported but by people, we know who they are, we don't really like where they're coming from, and then you can discount for that. But the problem is the great majority of people are already influenced by vast numbers of advertisements bought by millions and millions of dollars in a campaign, and don't know who lies behind it. There is insufficient transparency. Even if there were, there would still perhaps be that problem of sheer exposure. So it's a very, very hard problem, this one. And there's no question, you put your finger on it, that there's one of the most distorting things about democracy, even in its most ideal form, is the way that money distorts things.
We've got a great example going on right now in the Tasmanian state election where the gambling lobby is pouring money in because the Labor Party has said they want to get rid of pokies from pubs, and they're funding the Coalition's campaign and also doing an advertising campaign in their own right. And the spending disparity is enormous, and it's entirely in the interests of the companies that run the gambling in Tasmania. And it doesn't cost much to win an election through advertising in Tasmania because it's a fairly small market.
I think you made a really excellent point, and it ties into something you said earlier, that because where there are vested interests with titanic amounts of money, they are willing to take risks, and they can overcome hurdles in order to spend, in order to advance their agenda, especially, as you said, when it makes them more money. And so ultimately, it feels like anything we do before we address inequality is just tinkering in the margins. However, it's hard to imagine how we do anything to address inequality without taking some affirmative steps. But I think that it's good to have a clear head anyways, right? If you don't know what the shape of the problem is and what your intervention is supposed to do, if you kid yourself that transparency alone or some electoral college or public funding for elections on their own are the solution, as opposed to the stopgap on the way to a much more significant thing, which is to end the sort of grotesque eugenic spectacle of the alleged hereditary meritocracy that we live in. Until that happens, we're really just playing around with little tinkery fixes on the edge of something that's in real trouble.
Thank you. I think now we've got some time for questions. Okay.
Yes, I read an article, I think in The Atlantic a couple of years ago, where someone made the point that for many people, their personal narrative has kind of got lost and they realise that they're not moving ahead in the queue and so on. So you put in your lot in almost a feudal fashion with a power, with a national story. And so you seek the strength of America. That's going to be my story. I'm part of that, even if my personal life isn't so great. And so that's the way I'm going to vote. And I think that's a kind of there's a toxic part of politics there, and I'd just like to hear any of your opinions on that sort of matter.
I think that's a very good point that you've raised, a good point made in the Atlantic. The persuasion that we're offered to accept is to subsume our own local problems, our own personal identities into something which is a bit bigger. We can identify with it, get carried along with it, and get some satisfaction. Parallel to the satisfaction we get when the sports team we support wins. And then we feel good, and testosterone level rises, and so on. So we think if we're associated with something which itself is successful, then that either compensates or makes us feel good. And that, of course, is part of the rhetorical campaign run by any organization, any movement, any political party, as it might be, but it doesn't have to be politics, which wants to annex the support or the loyalty of people, by making them feel that if they are associated with it, they're going to get some of the benefit of its successes. Now that's as old as the hills. If you go back to the sophists of classical antiquity, that was a point that they made about why it was important to be very good at oratory, because oratory would capture people to your point of view or make them partisans of something that you wanted to succeed at. And you know that in making them feel part of that story, the thing that will be of value to them is the sense of achievement that they have in your achievement.
Anyone have anything to add to that? I'm going to ask you to ask the next question.
I guess it's for Corey and for Rebecca in a way, because it's qualitative and technological. Do you think we've reached a time where we could have parallel people's democracy through bringing out what are the issues and finding a way of getting enough people to give voice to, say, 5 issues in months before the election that actually set the agenda? So in a sense, we disintermediated the political party agenda setting. And, you know, as a lesbian, I didn't particularly enjoy having 6 or 10 weeks of having my personal life decided by the people as a faux political gesture. But I'm attracted to the idea of people actually having more unity about what matters most than politicians give us credit for, and using forms of technology to, so it's not about everyone being asked on the same day, but collectively, the collection of people's being asked 5 or 6 questions. They have a way of giving their answers to it, and that's put up in a multi-partisan way by a range of people outside of the direct system to set the agenda.
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Do you want to? I've got something to say.
It sounds, I mean, again, the fact that it hasn't worked swimmingly yet doesn't mean it never will, but some of the green shoots would be something like the Pirate Party's Liquid Democracy, which is transferable votes. So the idea is that you nominate an expert in a domain. So you say, for environmental expertise, Helen Caldicott's got my vote, and then she says, well, when it comes to geoengineering and sulfur in the troposphere, this one bloke I know is that guy. So he's got my vote and all the people who transferred their votes to me. And the idea is that you can withdraw that vote at any time. It worked reasonably well for the Pirate Party until they totally melted down for reasons that are probably unrelated to that. And the tool is free and open source software, so perhaps it will in some future iteration become more meaningful.
Yeah. So I'd have 2 points to make on that. I mean, I think that there's been some experiments with deliberative democracy and citizens' juries at some state and local level, which is interesting. They've had mixed results, but I think that there's a role that they can play in citizen decision-making outside an election campaign. And I think that we shouldn't, even though we're a reasonably stable democracy, we shouldn't be conservative in terms of how we approach new ways to get people involved, other than turning up to political parties and running for office. And the other thing I'd say, and this really angered me when the Prime Minister dismissed the idea of an Indigenous voice coming out of the heart of Uluru as the community wouldn't accept it. That's actually not the case. At the moment, you've got, for an issue which has had wonderful Indigenous advocates, but hasn't been explained to the community, there's still about 57% of people in polling saying we're open to that idea. Can you imagine if it was really presented to them with clarity and conviction? So I think the Australian community are less conservative than, strangely enough, the political parties about new ways in which we can enhance democratic processes.
Thank you. I think a lot of the discussion has been about what I would call the tyranny of democracy. And I think it was Churchill that said that democracy is the most terrible form of government until you consider all of the other alternatives. Are we heading towards what could be described as perhaps a post-democratic world? Could I get your thoughts on that?
A post what, sorry?
Post-democratic world.
Yeah.
Well, I think the real exemplar of that is Singapore, right? I think that, historically the idea was that once you have an autocracy, it's a basket case and, everybody ends up starving in a generation. And then Singapore came along and said, well, you can have the kinds of freedoms that matter to people who keep Ayn Rand on the bedstand and take away all the remaining freedoms, and you end up with this stable, thriving democracy with, an underclass and a lot of executions off stage. But, it sure has a lot of nice skyscrapers, which were historically, significantly better than kind of the Dobbin Wattle palaces of the autocracies that had preceded it. And so I think that, if you look at President Xi and what they're shooting for, they're like, can we scale Singapore up to 1.4 billion? I think the jury's out on it. They're sure purging the People's Party in Singapore, getting rid of their grandees and sending them off into the wilderness. So at least they got that part. But I don't know. I think that if I were pushing that agenda, I would be running around to everyone saying, wouldn't it be awesome if we could be Singapore too?
That's a very, very, very good point, that one, because since the Second World War, since 1945, most countries in the world have either become or pretended to become democracies. And that's because they thought that economic development, military power, global influence goes with democracy, like the US and Western Europe. But now, of course, with the example, not so much I think Singapore didn't persuade people for a long time, but certainly China is persuading people now that you can have economic growth, you can have wealth, you can have military power, influence, you can have high status, everybody can participate in China, which incidentally, Zhongguo means the central kingdom, so it becomes the central kingdom again of the world, without civil liberties, without democracy, with a continuing one-party state. Now you can imagine if you were the president of a developing country somewhere, you might think to yourself, well, hang on, I can have all those things, but I don't have to have democracy. I can stay in power for the rest of my life. That's the model which might become, perhaps is already becoming, too attractive to too many places. And democracy might seem to be old hat, especially for this one particular point, that democracies are inefficient. Because, there might be an election in 4 years' time and there might be a new tax regime or new regulations on emissions or something. And what business likes is predictability and stability. Business gets that in bucket loads in China. Everything's very predictable and stable there from the political and regime point of view, just so long as you keep your nose clean with the regime. But in a democracy, there are these imponderables. We who live in democracies know that inefficiency is a great protector of our civil liberties. Inefficiency is a good thing in a political order. And a super efficient system like the Singaporean or Chinese one is inimical to democracy. But if it is the new model, our grandchildren might be living in a world of China's. And that would mean that the era of civil liberties had long gone.
I'm going to take two quick final questions from you.
So we've had a wide-ranging opinions on Donald Trump in this little panel, I'd say. But if the reason Donald Trump gets elected, right, which I think we've kind of come to a conclusion is that people are feeling like they're disenfranchised and political parties seem to be such a major roadblock in solving these problems which people actually face, is it not better that we have someone like Donald Trump who comes along and at least gives the appearance that these problems have been solved rather than someone 10, 20, 50 years, say, down the line, who who is far more extreme, and we actually have Nazis, whole blocks of Nazis goose-stepping down, replace the American flag with our little own swastikas and such.
We did have a little bit of that.
Yeah.
There was a little bit of that.
Yeah, tiki torches. I would say that, like, it's not so much that it's a blessing that we get Donald Trump now rather than later when we've gotten in worse trouble, because, first of all, there's no guarantee that the next one won't be worse than him, right? But the other thing is that, but what I would say is that if we have to live through Donald Trump, at least let us make these 4 years, let us salvage something from these 4 years, and let it be the object lesson of why we need someone better than Donald Trump next time. You know, when life gives you SARS, you make sarsaparilla.
So for our last question, could I ask you in the black? Yes,
yes,
you. Sorry, to the people in front of you. Geography, unfortunately, wasn't part of the formula for questions, but.
Hi. So I think maybe this question locally should be reframed to what should we do about a lack of leadership in our democracy. And we've talked a lot about sort of the obstacles that are facing democracy and political parties and the social media and other media, and as well, you know, a few opportunities that those things perhaps present. But my question is, what do we do as academics, as researchers, as philosophers, as journalists to support young, emerging leaders to help democracy thrive amongst the chaos?
Interesting. I mean, I think it's really almost impossible in the system that we have now, as it exists now, for someone to be a convincing leader, because the political parties that they have to lead are so terminally broken that it's very difficult for someone to stand up and say, I believe in this, follow me, you know, I have this agenda, and take people with them, because the coalition of people they're trying to lead is too diverse and the institutions are too broken. So for younger people, I mean, I would probably advise them to try to look for ways to subvert the parties, to go around them, to use the sort of democratic possibilities that social media and new ways of organising give to just bypass parties and find ways to lead with ideas rather than lead through the structure as it is.
Oh, sorry, please.
Oh, yeah, no, you go and then I'll go and then he goes.
Oh, sure. That's a lovely thing. You know, I believe that the first casualty of every battle is the plan of attack, and trying to figure out a way to get from A to Z is a waste of time, because all that planning will go away as soon as the terrain shifts, and most of it's unknowable anyway. But in software, we have this idea called hill climbing, which is where when you don't know the terrain, you try to chart a course on a kind of ad hoc heuristic basis. And it's based on the metaphor of an ant that has eyes in the front of its head. It can't see where the high ground is, but it wants to find the high ground. And what it has are a bunch of legs, and it knows which leg is on the highest ground. It takes a step that way. And then it sees now in this new stable position, is there another leg that's on high ground? It takes a step that way. And it doesn't know what its course is charting. It may not be taking the most efficient course, but it always reaches the highest local ground. And so I think that my theory of change, the thing that gets me out of bed every morning, is I imagine a thing I can do that might materially improve my situation, and I strive for it on the basis not that there's a clear path from there to a better world, but from a new vantage point in which something has been materially improved, even in the smallest way, there might be another step that suggests itself. And I think that stepwise path is all we've got in this very dynamic world.
I suppose your question was about what can researchers and educators and academics do to be good leaders. And every now and then I get asked to speak at a university for 5 minutes about, you know, at some graduation, it's your opportunity to lecture people about how they should live their lives. But one of the things I do say is, I say, look, most of you will not go into politics, but most of you have been educated. The best thing you can possibly do now is be great advocates for research and evidence-based opinion. I never thought that would be a radical thing to do. You often talk to people in the media, not anybody from The Guardian, and they'll ask your opinion and they go, well, I've got no evidence for that. Oh, but what's your opinion? And I'm like, don't you understand that it's actually a problem to be out there all the time talking about your opinions without evidence? So I say to whatever you are, if you're doing science or social work or a lawyer, be a great communicator and make sure that outside your area of evidence that you apply that rigorous process of, is my opinion about asylum seekers based on evidence? Is my opinion about corporate tax based on evidence? The defence of evidence-based opinion, I think, is the best possible thing we can all do in all our professions to really show leadership.
Look, thank you for those questions. I might end the questions there because I'd like to give the panel, or invite the panel, to reflect very succinctly on what we might expect and hope for democracies in the future. Lenore, I'd like you to start.
Well, as an editor, I'm going to do my damnedest to try to create a sustainable website, news site in Australia that can deliver fact-based, evidence-based news from a progressive point of view, and hold powerful people to account and prosecute and analyse policy and events. As citizens, I think we can lobby or advocate for the kinds of changes that we've discussed tonight in terms of political transparency and accountability. We can also, I think, as citizens, really consciously remind ourselves that politics is supposed to be about civilised disagreement, that disagreement in politics is good, that's what's meant to happen, and that, you know, you can have a constructive disagreement with people about politics. And then where democracy goes after that, when we all do those things, I really don't know. It depends on, I think, how political parties adapt to the massive disruption that they're facing, whether they keep wrestling with each other on the railway track or whether they notice that there's a train coming down the track that's about to hit them. What happens to the other forms of democratic expression that sort of go around them? We're kind of living participants in a time of massive disruption and upheaval.
Thank you. Corey.
So I have dedicated my life to fighting for a free, fair, and open internet, and it's not because I'm a starry-eyed technology optimist. It's because I understand that while almost everything is more important than the internet, climate justice, justice for Indigenous people, justice around gender, income inequality, and so on, that all of those fights are going to be won and lost on the internet. Without a free, fair, and open internet, all those fights are lost before they're joined. It's the necessary, insufficient precondition for a better world. And so today there is this strain because surveillance capitalism has grown up with the internet. There's this strain of thinking that says that everyone who has cared about the destiny of the internet was a fool. And I think that unless we dedicate ourselves with all the gravitas that's due to this subject, to this nervous system of the 21st century, to ensuring that it's free and fair and open, that all of the other things that we care about are going to fail. And so I would ask you tonight, when you think about your future, that you think about what you can do to support those causes, and you take notice of this deadly combination we have of things that are vitally important and incredibly boring. Right, the future of cryptography. Your Prime Minister just said, I don't know what the laws of mathematics are, but I assure you that in Australia, the laws of Australia are the laws of Australia. He was defending the idea that it should be illegal to have working cryptography in this country, so that the firmware updates that come to your pacemaker and the seismic dampers that keep your buildings from falling down can never be truly authenticated, so that he can spy on people he thinks might be terrorists. It is the most god-awful dereliction of duty I can imagine. And if we can't figure out how to secure our networks, we're dead before it starts. And so that's what I ask you to consider tonight after this conversation. Thank you.
Rebecca?
So I was listening to Corey and forgot what I was thinking. Well, future of democracy, is that it? I want to take Lenore's idea about the people who are kind of creatively working outside the political parties and government, and I think some of them in some areas are building up extraordinary steam. And my hope, I'm not one of those guys in Dante with their head spinning around. I hate people who call themselves futurists. I want to kill them. But my hope is that the success of those people working out of the system just builds and builds and kind of presses in on the system to bring about what is, let's realistically, going to be incremental change. Their work will be on communicating with the public, and the public start to bring those claims through the political system. So they'll be the last to change, but my hope is that the success of people working outside, whether it be on climate change or new forms of energy or whatever that might be, ways to mitigate problems around social cohesion or approaches to drug rehabilitation, that they move the political class. That's my hope for democracy.
Finally, Anthony.
I think pretty well everybody in this room would agree, and certainly I think people up here on the panel would think that engagement, being interested, getting involved, being alert to what's happening, taking responsibility politically is a civilian duty, a civic duty. But one has to recall that people also have families and careers and health problems and saving for the holidays and so on. So we're all of us busy and distracted and can't constantly all the time be worrying about what's happening in Canberra or in Westminster. And therefore, what we want is a reliable, responsible, responsive political order in our democracies, so that when we're not paying attention, we're not worried that they're doing really stupid or bad things behind our backs.
You haven't been in Australia for the last few weeks.
Oh, well, I don't like to trespass on your pain, but I am conscious of the problems that can accrue from making your staffers pregnant and so on. But anyway, I think the point is that we have a right. I mean, the two great points that the one has to remember is that just in virtue of being citizens, we have a right to a voice. We have a right to a say. We have a right to recall people from office if they don't perform their office well. That's a really important, central, key thing in a democracy. But there is another right, and that right is to responsible, reliable, good enough government. And the only way that you can get that is by having institutions and the operation of those institutions which are not subject to the whim of individuals or to partisan distortion or to being purchased by concealed big corporate funding or something. We want functioning institutions so that when we are trying to look after our teenage kids or go on holiday, we can be reasonably confident anyway that we've got responsible government which is ultimately answerable to us. So we want that to be the case. Now that is what democracy offers. That's what democracy offers, providing that those institutions and the practices in those institutions are got right. They've gone wrong. They have gone wrong pretty well everywhere. They've gone wrong in the UK and the US recently. Proof positive, Trump and Brexit. They're proof positive that things have gone wrong. So what we need is to get them right. How? Well, you can have a revolution, you can have huge reform, you can persuade the young to go outside the institutions, and that would be wonderful if they were to do it. But actually, there are some reasonably modest and moderate things you could do to get it back on track so that you could get what I describe as good enough government, because we all know that outside this room, in our world, nothing is perfect.
Thank you, all of you, for those final thoughts. Just before we thank our panel, though, I'd just like to remind you of two things. One is that there will be some book signings out in the foyer. The second thing is to keep an eye on the Centre for Ideas website to look out for future events in this and another series. If I could just close, though, by offering a few thanks for the people who made this evening possible, to the staff of the recital hall, to Alice from the Centre for Ideas, indeed to Lachlan for sharing his ideas about democracy with me. Could I also thank, though, in a very big and hearty way, Anne Mossop, who's the director of the UNSW Centre for Ideas. It's a terrific initiative and producing lots of fantastic things. Can I thank you all very much as an audience for your participation and for your questions and your attention to these issues. But lastly, can I ask you all to join me in giving a big, hearty, democratic thank you to our wonderful panel. Thank you.
Very, very good.
Perfect.
Thank you.